there friends, thanks for joining me again. And lately I have been hearing a lot of debate over what is the right way to buy a house, whether you finance it or whether you save up enough money until you can buy it in cash. Well, I wanted to crunch what I call the nerdy numbers and try and come up with a facetious situation to see if we could maybe solve this debate and figure out which side is truly right. So here we go. We have a couple I'm calling Average Andy and Amy. They want to either crunch the numbers, whether they want to buy in cash, which is going to be this side, or buy with a mortgage, which is that side. They have a median income of $70,995, which is the average median income in the United States. Their average rent in the United States is $1,412 for all types of housing units, whether it's small little condos or big large family houses. You know, the average right down the center is about $1,412 according to Zillow. So that's what our average Andy and Amy pay. And the average sales price in the United States is $236,450. So that's the sort of house they're looking for as well. The average house according to Zillow. Now, the average savings rate for people under 35 currently is sitting at negative 1.8%. And so we can't, use that number, because that's negative. They're going backwards, unfortunately. Anyway, the next savings rate for the people who are 35 to 44 is 2.6%. However, that's only about $1,846. So, we're going to have to use a little better number than that in order to figure out this whole thing. Because if they were trying to save $236,000 at a rate of less than $2,000, I mean, that's going to take them well over 100 years to get to it. So we're going to have to just pretend that average Amy and Andy are digging deep on this one. They're going to try and save a full 15% of their income to try to come down with their down payment, or whether or not they're going to use that, to pay for their house in cash. So let's pretend that they're saving that 15%, and they're hoping that, they'll eventually save enough to be able to buy that house in cash. So if they were doing that, in order to save that $236,000 median home sale price, it would take Amy and Andy 22 years to save that much money. Here's the problem with that though. Houses appreciate in value, meaning they go up in value. The average amount, the historical average amount of home appreciation, again, this is, average because there are different markets and things like that. The average appreciation rate is actually 4%, and that's compounding, which means it's 4% on the $236,000 the first year, and then you add that to the new number, and then it's 4% of that new number, and then the next year it's 4% of that new number, etc. So it's not 4% of this number the whole time, it's of the new number. Again, it's compounding. So after 22 years of savings, their house that they wanted to buy would actually appreciate up to $569,000. 22 years is a long time. So while that may seem a little bit, shocking, it is actually possible. And again, the historical average is actually 6%. So even going with 4%, say their area isn't quite, the houses aren't appreciating quite as quickly, that's a pretty conservative number, to be honest. So if Amy and Andy were truly trying to save enough money to buy a house in cash, it kind of seems like that stick with the string on it and the turtle who's trying to follow along the carrot. Like the further it walks, it just never ever gets closer to it. It's like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It just doesn't seem like it's something that could ever actually really happen. Now again, this is like a totally facetious situation, but yeah. So they would have been setting aside $2,300 for their housing costs because they were spending this on rent, the $1,400 just over, and then how much they were trying to save, that $10,000, $650, works out to about $888 a month that they were trying to save away. So housing costs, both present and hopeful future, they were setting aside $2,300. That's a fair amount of money to set aside for housing. Okay, now let's go to the other side. That is what it would have looked like for these people to try to buy a house in cash. Let's see what it would look like if they were trying to put a mortgage on it this time. Okay, so if they were to buy a house for the same exact price, the $236,450, according to the mortgage calculators, the mortgage payment should be about $1,125. On a 15-year mortgage rate, however, that would be about $1,630. Both of those numbers are considerably lower than that $2,300 that they were trying to set aside. So already they're living more comfortably in this house than they would have been in their rental, whatever it was, apartment, etc., for less money. So already this is looking like it's an easier, cheaper solution. But let's go on. So if they were to take the housing money that they would have set aside, this $2,300, and instead of putting it toward rent and then saving it, if they put all of that money into their mortgage, according to Bankrate's estimated payment mortgage calculator, with a mortgage amount of $200,000, say that's how much they had to borrow. Hopefully I'm not losing any of you. If they had to borrow $200,000 and they were to take that money that they would have been putting toward their rent, because they're not paying that anymore, obviously, because they're living in their house, and then the extra that they would have been trying to save and then put that in toward their mortgage, they would have had their house paid off in less than 10 years. According to Bankrate's estimated payment mortgage calculator, it actually turns out to be 9 years and 11 months, almost exactly. So yeah, even with a little hiccup along the way, say they needed a water heater and they weren't able to put as much money into their mortgage that month, they still have this house paid off in 10 years. These people, if they fork in the road, they would have chose this one, they would have ended up never really being able to buy a house in cash, because if they would have tried to save this amount by the time the 22 years came around, again, it just never would have happened. They never would have been able to save enough to be able to buy that house in cash. This way, you finance the house, you're living in it along the way, you can be fixing things, you can be, redoing the tile the way you want to, you can be having the house value appreciate and move on to something bigger if you wanted. Maybe they wanted to urban homestead and they wanted to, put in some fruit trees, that sort of thing. So they could be putting roots down and have a nice place to be living in, paint the walls whatever color they want, have all the pets they want, these types of things, all the perks that homeowners get to have, and still have their house paid off if they would have done, put away the same amount of money in 10 years. Even if they didn't, even if they just got their 15-year mortgage, they're still spending less than they would have been trying to spend on their rent and then save, and living in the house for cheaper and still have it paid off in 15 years. So I don't want to make it sound like this is the only right answer, though. Just crunching these nerdy numbers with just the average people spending average rents, saving above average amounts, of course, doesn't necessarily paint a full picture of what it would actually look like in all markets. Now, if there are places like, Decatur, Illinois, or, places in Ohio, Toledo, Ohio, where their houses are really inexpensive, obviously that would be a whole lot easier for somebody with a $70,000, annual income to buy a house that's $100,000. So yeah, there are instances where buying a house in cash actually makes sense. When the house prices are below the national average, it makes sense. When interest rates are higher, it makes sense. Right now, interest rates are extremely low. Maybe there are different situations people have. They want to buy a tiny house, or they want to put it on their own land, or they want to actually build something, or they buy a fixer-upper, or there are different economic conditions, things like that. So there are lots of different factors that can play into this. So there are times when I do believe that buying a house and paying in cash would make sense. If you had a house in, say, California and you were moving, to Missouri or something like that, you could probably buy a lot nicer house there than you could elsewhere, and maybe even pay in cash. So if you have a higher salary again and the housing market is lower, that's obviously a doable goal. If you have a lower salary, though, it's going to be harder to try and save enough to be able to buy a house in cash. And again, there are so many different local market factors. Maybe the houses aren't appreciating as fast as 4% a year, and so it may not be as hard to try and save, to be able to reach those goals. The size and type of the house, whether or not you're willing to do the work, like if it was a fixer-upper, or maybe even other economic, conditions, like say we were to have another, great recession like we had a little while ago where house prices plummet and things like that. So, yeah, I guess the answer is it depends. For an average person buying an average house, in an average area, it may not make sense to try to save enough money to be able to buy that house, because the houses are going to continue to appreciate, and so the goals that you have to save may not be able to be achieved. And maybe there are times when people won't have rent to pay. Maybe they get along really well with mom and dad, and so they don't even have that cost. So they can put a lot more money down, you know, or put more money away, I should say, you know, because they don't have those types of costs to calculate in. So every situation is unique. Absolutely nobody knows the future, you know. We have no idea what's going to happen, and so it's really difficult to say which one is the right answer, but I will say that my best bet, in my opinion, would be to buy with the mortgage, and with the interest rates as low as they are, to buy down your debt, you know, quickly by trying to pay extra payments if you can. So hopefully this video was helpful to you. I'm Frugal Green Girl. We'll see you next time.